It's amazing when the technology works, you know?
Yes.
It's
Well,
just,
I've had pretty good luck so far, but there have been a few challenging moments. Unfortunately, trying to teach online does not
oh,
work
yeah.
very well.
Well, I mean, it's a matter of mastery. A lot of people have achieved it, but yes, it's a whole different deal. All right, so are you ready to go, Samuel?
I'm ready to go.
Wonderful. Let me just click right here. And off we go. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Charles Moskowitz here. Welcome to the program. And my guest is Samuel Goldman. He teaches political science and is the executive director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom at the George Washington University. He is literary editor of Modern Age and author of God's Country, Christian Zionism in America, which is also available at the University of Pennsylvania Press. And Samuel, I had you on today because you have just published a book, After Nationalism, which caught my interest. How you doing?
Very well. I should offer one minor correction. I haven't yet published After Nationalism.
Okay,
It is in the hands of the press and is scheduled to appear in the spring.
wonderful. Well, it's certainly a topical issue right now with a rise in international nationalism and populism. The election of President Trump has been included as an element of that. In Europe, you have Brexit and you have the rise of nationalism, particularly in Eastern Europe. You've got nationalist movements around the world. India comes to mind with the election of Modi. And of course, in China, you've got the rebellion in Hong Kong. So, in a nutshell, how do you gauge the rise of nationalism or the era that we're in right now?
Well, I think that the recent rise of nationalism and populism, and perhaps we should spend a little bit of time distinguishing between those and some of the other terms that are used in this conversation, um, is a response to the perceived failures of liberal globalization since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
The lowering of barriers to travel, to trade, and to ideas, the extension of the authority of international association, the adoption of an originally American, but now really global popular culture, have all had some positive results, and those should not be forgotten. But they've also caused a great deal of distress to large portions of the population throughout the world that feels themselves economically threatened, culturally marginalized, and politically ignored. And in different ways, I think all of the parties and politicians you've mentioned appeal to those sentiments.
Now, do you think, Samuel, that there is a way for the nations of the world, the nation states, the cultures, the societies of the world to enjoy the benefits and blessings of international trade and international exchange while at the same time maintaining their not only national sovereignty but their identity as groups and as cultures? I mean, is there a way to balance that, do you think?
Well, it's very difficult to find the appropriate balance. Rather, what we observe historically is a sort of oscillating pendulum from one extreme to the other. So, a lot has been written about the ostensible parallels between the present moment and the 1930s or 1940s in Europe. I actually think that's the wrong comparison. A more useful one is to the 1870s and 1880s, which was the eclipse of the first great era of liberalism, which was characterized by many of the same economic and social discontents as the present. And it was really in that moment that the historical alliance between nationalism and liberalism began to be severed, and nationalist movements throughout Europe and even to some extent in the United States began to present themselves as opponents or enemies of liberalism. And I think that's where we are in the process, much more than we find ourselves in a situation comparable to the 1930s.
Well, the American idea of nationalism has always been different than what we conventionally view nationalism as, which is fascism. The American idea was limited government, a federation of states, basically sovereign states, that maintained a free trade agreement and maintained a national government that was just strong enough to keep the national order and a certain cultural cohesion, but yet not beyond that. And that we've always been suspicious of government. We don't, going back to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was one of the major documents that led to the American Revolution. We view government as as in a sense a fearful master, as I think Washington said, if I can paraphrase. But yet, we are nationalistic in the sense that we want to have a cohesive national society that handles very certain and very select elements and items. And I think that became corrupted, as you say, like in the 1870s and 1880s, when with the formation of nation states in Europe, particularly Germany and Italy, you had the darker side of that, which was international colonialism. The massive expansion all over the world through force and subterfuge of whole nations and states in Africa and Asia, with the ultimate example being India, and that the United States kind of got in on it too. I mean, toward the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and it kind of corrupted the idea of the nation state and of nationalism, I think.
Well, I think that what you're describing is certainly an American idea. Where I might disagree is your description of it as the American idea. One of the things that I try to show in my forthcoming book is that American political and intellectual and cultural history really includes a tension between different conceptions of nationalism, all of which are present to some degree throughout American history, but also have particular moments of dominance. So I don't think it's the case that there was once a sort of pristine American civic nationalism that then became corrupted. I think that Americans from the very foundation of our country have been distinctly perplexed about what it means to be an American, about what the character of this nation is. And while that perplexity isn't absolutely unique, there are examples of comparable tensions in France or in Germany or in the other great nations of Europe. I do think that it is particularly acute in the United States, and you see a reflection of that in the name of our country. Which is actually rather strange, as the pluralist theorist Horace Kallen pointed out around a century ago. The United States of America has a peculiar anonymity. The United States of America, the country is not called America, right? And indeed, Mexicans and Canadians have an equally good claim to be Americans, as they enjoy pointing out. United States is a political form, but is rather non-specific. There isn't the close connection between people and place that characterizes classic European nationalism. When you think of a place of Germany, for example, Deutschland is the land of the Germans, of the German speakers, or Scotland, or even Italy, which is not a nation that extends back to Roman times, but has been conceived as a particular place with particular qualities for thousands of years. America isn't quite like that. And I think that we have been wrestling with the ways in which we are and are not a nation for more than 200 years.
Well, when I say that the American idea of the nation state, I don't mean that in a chauvinistic way that there's something unique. I think that we've embraced certain universal principles that actually go back to the Bible. that and that various nations have embraced these same principles in contrast to their own culture. And I think that the principle there that we embrace that is biblical, and it goes back to the book of Genesis, is that man was created, and women, it does say men and women, were created in God's image. Thus, God created us. And that thus we are not gods. We don't have the concept of the emperor, king, the divine, half human, half godlike ruler, the divine right of kings. We feel that as imperfect beings created in the image of God, we're not God, and we derive our limited sovereignty from God. And then we give a small grant of that sovereignty to a state to protect and defend that sovereignty. It's not, we don't worship the state, which I think was a development in Europe that really took off in the 20th century with or the 19th century with Hegel, and which precedes it with the very centralized and universal Catholic Church, and then I think Martin Luther started the state churches. We also are not based on ethnicity, even though most of our founders were English, white Englishmen. That's true, but I don't think they thought of themselves that way. It was more the idea of citizenship was primary, as and that there was certain responsibilities connected to that. Um, but I think that it became corrupted. I mean, not to repeat myself, but by this idea that we hopped into the colonial game in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then we became entangled in the world in a way that I don't think has been helpful to us or to other nations. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
not at
No,
all.
I was just going to say, even in the late 18th century, though, there are disagreements among the framers of the Constitution and important early Republican statesmen who were not participants in the Constitutional Convention. And as early as the 1790s, you can see a division between the followers of Jefferson, who became Democratic Republicans, who endorsed a broader and you might say more creedal or principle based conception of America, and those who became Federalists, who, even when they were open in principle to immigration, believed that the American character depended on the maintenance of a specific Anglo-Protestant character. So one of the things I think we tend to do as part of our own national ideology is to assume that there was a consensus in 1776 or 1789, and if we can just figure it out and believe the same things, we will solve our problems. I don't think any such consensus existed, or if it did, it didn't exist for very long. And if you look, for example, at some of the debates surrounding the passage of the first naturalization acts, setting terms for admission to the political community of the United States, you can see some of the same arguments that we hear today about assimilation, about the importance of culture, about principles versus communal belonging. And those were bitter discussions, bitter debates more than 200 years ago. And this is something I do a little bit in my book, and that other scholars have done much more extensively.
Well, I think that we did have a consensus, and that was the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, and it created a constitution and Federalist Papers and a Bill of Rights, and it really established the idea that, in a way, our consensus is that we're not going to have a consensus. We have limited government. We send representatives who represent regional and local values, and that they don't have to agree. I mean, that's why we have. That's why the Constitution gives the legislature, Article 1, Section 8, all of the power to legislate, because they are not one person. They recognize that there's going to be an ongoing debate over issues, and that as far as immigration goes, yeah, I mean, there certainly is. There's been racism in this country, of course. That's a darker side of human nature. But at the same time, if you look at, for example, the letters of John Adams, and you look at the some of the letters between Jefferson and Madison, they talk very approvingly about the different ethnic groups that made up the original colonies, whether they be German or whether they have different religions. They were all Christian, of course, but they understood that the United States was not any one hidebound group. And I think this was very well expressed by Washington in his farewell address, where he said, look, we all have different, and I think he used manners and modes, of worship and of belief and of background, but that he hopes that all of those different modes, while maintaining themselves, will put the national interest first. That we would be Americans first, and that we would then be free to affiliate with whatever manner, as Washington said, we wanted to, if we chose to. And I think that's been the American creed. I mean, in
Well,
general.
I mean, I think that vision, which can be associated with the symbol of the melting pot or crucible, is one American vision, and it has been affirmed by important figures at crucial moments, like Washington's farewell address, which incidentally was not an address and was probably drafted by Hamilton.
Hamilton, that's
Um,
right.
Nevertheless, at other times, some of the same figures have expressed very different views. And even those who have endorsed in principle this sort of mixture or overarching association of people of different backgrounds, different manners, as you quote Washington, have also been very concerned about the limits. So the very first Congress in 1790, in one of its first acts, passed a naturalization act, setting conditions for becoming a citizen, which is particularly important if you believe that it's really citizenship, it's legal and political status
Mm-hmm.
that determines one's identity as an American. But that naturalization law restricted naturalization to free white immigrants. And believe it or not, it remained on the books until 1952. Until 1952, it was technically illegal for people who were not considered white. And there are a number of court cases that argue precisely this question: what does it mean to be white? Were not permitted to naturalize. So it's true that certainly in comparison to the European ethnic nationalism that arose later in the 19th century, early American nationalism looks much more open and flexible. But even then, there were limits, and that Naturalization Act was signed by our first president, George Washington. So I think again, it's not so easy as returning to an original consensus. We have to grapple with some of these tensions that have been with us for a very long time, and many. I think we're having this conversation in light of recent protest movements
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
other forms of civic disorder. That's not something that was invented last year or in 1965 or in 1941. We are having the same discussion over and over again.
Well, that's because we are a multiracial society. Um, Samuel, did the 1790 Immigration Act actually say the word white in
Yes,
it?
the quote is "free white."
Free white and 21, right?
As the saying goes. Actually, the saying is "free white in 21." I don't know what age the Naturalization Act set, but yes, it uses the word white.
And it also was only for property owners, would be
So
have citizenship.
naturalization is not restricted to property owners, but at that time in many states, the exercise of the franchise was graduated, such that you had to own property to vote at all, and even not all owners of property could necessarily vote in all elections. And that remained the case until the 1830s, more or less.
It's an interesting question. I mean, how did they define white? Because I think that the definition of white has changed. I believe that the founding fathers viewed anyone who was not from England as not white. They didn't view the Irish as white. Germans were viewed as like Mongols, some
Right, right.
exotic foreigner, right? I mean,
In
Swedes were viewed as some kind of Laplanders. I mean, they
right.
didn't. So it was a very, very different view of whiteness
In,
then.
in the 1750s, Benjamin Franklin writes a famous letter describing the German settlers of Pennsylvania, the ancestors of the Pennsylvania Dutch, as they're known.
Right.
It's a bit of a confusion. Dutch means Deutsch,
Exactly.
and he says, in effect, as you're suggesting, these are not white people. Only Englishmen are white, and
But
he
weren't they
expresses all of
fully
these fears.
enfranchised at the time of the founding of the republic? I mean, they were made. They had a majority in, I think, Pennsylvania at that
They
point.
were. And one of the ironies of American history is that racial categories become important as a way of accommodating the ethnic and cultural diversity of the population. If you use a more traditional standard of ethnic nationalism, then people like the Pennsylvania Dutch or the Irish or the Scandinavian immigrants or the Jews would be very hard to fit in. And
Right.
Americans didn't want to do that, partly for principled reasons, but partly because all of these people were here and it creates all sorts of problems. So in America, the category of white became a substitute for national membership. And it was enough to be white on a broad definition to be admitted to the political community, even if you were not of British descent, even if you were not a Protestant, even if you were not a Christian. So the category of whiteness, I say, is paradoxical because it was in many respects a form of inclusion, a much broader inclusion than European nationalism, but that created a different sort of boundary that had
Hmm.
the tragic consequences with which we are familiar.
Well, I mean, I think as you may be implying, we have to look at it in the context of the times, and I believe that Jefferson, basically, in many of his letters, expressed the opinion that Native Americans were white,
That was
as
a
long
wide,
as long as they converted to Christianity. And I think that Washington viewed Jews as white.
yeah.
Um,
Uh,
if you look at the letter to the Toro Synagogue, which is a plaque on the grounds of that famous synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, I've been there. You know,
As a matter of fact, those beliefs are connected because it was widely believed in the colonial period and early republic that the Native Americans were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. But
uh,
you're absolutely right that Jefferson and others considered Native Americans white or white equivalent and open to assimilation. On the other hand, he insists in his notes on the state of Virginia on what we would call a biological or genetic difference between blacks and whites that makes it impossible for blacks to participate as equals in civil society. So
right.
there again, you see how these categories can be inclusive in one sense, but exclusive in another.
Well, I think that maybe, and again, you're the historian here, but I think
I'm
that
not a
the
historian. I
oh,
should be
okay,
very
thank
clear.
you.
I'm a political
Political
scientist,
science.
and I sometimes pretend to be a historian.
Oh, all right, thank you. Well, I'm an armchair historian. I think that the perhaps the motivation of that language in the Immigration Act was the corruption of slavery and the balance that had to be struck to bring about a union meant that the states that had slavery had to be able to feel comfortable enough that they could continue with that barbarous institution. Thus, you put in the word white as a way of making a kind of assuaging their suspicions about welcoming black people into our order and as equals. And that, of course, that question was resolved by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. It took a civil war to do it, but it was done. And the only other thing I'd add is that in 1925, the immigration bill signed by Calvin Coolidge had racist elements to it. It favored like Western and Northwestern
Right.
Europeans as immigrants, but it also opened the door to all Latin Americans
Yes.
were welcomed in as citizens. So it was
That's right.
not, I suppose it depends on how various generations, view these things.
Well, I think the example of the 1925 Immigration Act is another example of how flexible these categories are. And around the same time that we're discussing, Latin Americans, or what we now call Hispanics, were regarded as presumptively white in effect, and were not considered a cultural threat or likely to undermine the stability of American society. On the other hand, Asian immigrants were regarded
Oh
as
yeah.
profoundly dangerous and unassimilable, radically alien. And really, within living memory, almost, those stereotypes have been reversed. And Asian immigrants or Asian Americans are considered models of assimilation and participation in American life. And there's great anxiety around Latinos or Hispanics. So one of the benefits, I think, of this kind of research, and one of the things that I hope my readers will enjoy, is finding that these categories that we regard as so permanent and fixed are much more malleable than
Well,
we are.
yeah, I mean, you're describing the fact that from day one, this society has struggled with a balance between citizens' rights and national rights, and this darker side of our nature, which is racial and ethnic prejudice. I mean, you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s. It was motivated by a racial fear that the Asians were going to take over California at a time
That's
when
right.
California was still very sparsely settled, and that they would move en masse. There was also a labor element to that as well. The labor unions wanted to protect the value of labor. They didn't want cheap labor to come into the country. There's that same element to this day with regard to immigration. I mean,
Yes,
labor,
absolutely.
sure.
Absolutely. I think what these examples show is that, contrary to the almost cartoonish account that you find in many popular left-wing historians, but also popular right-wing historians, um, these are not struggles between good and evil, right and wrong, oppressed and oppressors. And again, you find that groups that seem to be on the right side of justice on one issue look much less appealing on some other issue. And that's true with the case you mentioned of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which were pushed through largely by abolitionist Republicans. They were
Right.
bitterly opposed to slavery, and some among them, although not all, supported the continuing military occupation of the South to ensure that Black Americans could vote and participate in civil life. But they had exactly the views you describe about Asians. So who is the good guy there?
Mm.
Suddenly, it's not so easy to tell. And in these cases, again, I think searching for heroes and villains is really distorting of our understanding.
Well, it has to be put in the context of their times. I mean, I like to read old newspapers and magazines, and recently I picked up a copy of Harper's Magazine published in 1890s, and their hair was on fire over the French Canadian immigration
Right. To New
into
England.
into New England. I mean, that they would refer to them as swarthy. I mean, they're using language that nobody would use in their right mind to this today.
Right.
And they weren't white. I mean, these are French Canadians. So this is a fact of history. I think that I tend to look at it a little bit more as a glass half full than half empty, because after all, the United States is the most multiracial, multi ethnic society in history. You look at Europe, you look at Asia for that matter, Africa, these are usually either a single ethnic or racial background, or there's one ethnic or racial background that completely dominates and subjugates minorities. So, our experiment obviously is imperfect, but yet it still holds, even in a shaky way, this principle that the individual derives rights from God, that the individual is primary, and that we compete on a relatively level playing field. Which brings me up to today, Samuel. We have this resurgence around the world of national movements. It's on the one hand, it's worrisome because of recent history. When you had the rise of Nazism, you had communism, which of course is an international nationalism and wants to control the entire world, and both of which are antithetical to the American idea. I guess that my question to you is, how much of those ideas, those regressive views of nationalism, how much do they uh, dominate, or how much do they influence modern national movements, including the American national movement today, which I would define as the backers of President Trump?
Right. Well, I think there are different answers in different cases. And one of the things that I found frustrating in some of the recent analysis of nationalism around the world is that it looks for just one explanation that will somehow be useful in the United States, in Britain, in Hungary, and in India. And those cases may just be too different to be open to the same explanation. In America specifically, I don't think, contrary to some suggestions, that the influence of literal fascism or explicit racial hatred is very great. It may exist, and in a big country you will find examples of virtually anything you want. I don't think that's the major factor. What I do think is the major factor is the demographic decline of a white Christian majority that for much of American history, and certainly within living memory, has been able to set the terms of political and cultural membership. That doesn't mean other people couldn't participate. They did, and they flourished. But the standards of normality, of what it means to be a normal American, were set by its white Christian majority. And that is changing. And as the demographic and cultural power of that majority declines, I think that we will see a further, I don't want to say regression, but embrace of tactics of what are seen as cultural and political self-defense. And Trump is an instrument of that self-defense. I mean, one hears again and again and again from supporters of President Trump, I support him because he fights for me. He stands up for me. These other people, these other institutions, they're for someone else. And in that sense, I do think that we are in a very difficult situation.
Well, I think that yes, it has to be admitted that there is an ethnic and maybe even a racial aspect to that support, but I think it's much bigger than that, and I think it does cross over racial and ethnic lines. It's this idea of a nation maintaining and reasserting its sovereign right to protect its own labor, its own industry, its own national interests, which have been frittered away by based on a lot of people's views into a world order. And that's something that affects all Americans, regardless of their racial background. However, we should address this very uncomfortable and unfashionable question, and we should tread a little lightly when we do so. And that is the fact that there is a demographic shift, and that this country will be probably a majority minority society. I think I've seen statistics that say that that'll be around the year 2030. And I mean, everyone thinks about this, whether regardless of your ethnic background, and everyone wonders about the ramifications of it, even though it's unfashionable to do so. However, the question should be asked. This has been, in a de facto sense, a traditionally a white Protestant country. It's not, even, I mean, the 19th century saw the struggles of the introduction of Catholicism, and that there are certain cultural virtues to that. Not necessarily, I don't believe there's a racial virtue to it at all, because I think anyone can embrace those values and do. But we should ask, I mean, are those cultural values that were brought forth by the original English colonists, of course, of which my ancestors were not part of,
Neither
and
were
probably
mine.
nor were yours. However, is that something that is worth valuing and preserving in a cultural sense, not in an individual sense? Because individually we can all and should be able to determine our own destinies. But is that something that we ought to value? Is that something that we may look back on and wish we had valued?
Well, it depends what the virtues are and to what extent they depend on some conscious adherence or affirmation of Anglo-Protestant culture
Yeah,
or heritage. So the political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote a famous book on this question, a controversial book called Who We Are, published in 2005, I believe. And he tried to enumerate what he saw as the virtues or habits that were derived from the Anglo-Protestant origins of this country and part of its population. Although you say this will one day be a majority minority country, it's been a very long time since the majority was Anglo-Protestant, at least 100 years and possibly more than that. But anyway,
true.
Huntington identifies virtues like hard work and devotion to family. And yet, these are the virtues that today are closely associated again with Asian Americans who are neither Anglo nor in many cases Protestant. So if these virtues or habits can be separated from their historical origin or historical vehicle, that's probably okay. But I think it's too much to ask that all in America, as it really exists now, regard themselves as in some way subordinate to or adopted children of the Anglo-Protestant settlers. I just don't think that's going to work. And the reason I don't think it's going to work is that it hasn't worked in the past. The transformation of American popular history and culture after World War II was really about accepting that people who not only were not descended from the Adamses or the Jeffersons or the Washingtons, but weren't even going to pretend to be descended from them, were nevertheless fully American and had something to contribute to America. And I think that is good. Others may think it is bad, but however you evaluate it, we're not going back.
Well, no, I think it also is good, and I think it adheres to the principles enumerated by Washington in his farewell address. That, in a sense, up until maybe recently, I don't know, the Anglo Protestant nation with a small p, uh, ethnic groups assimilated into it successfully while maintaining their separate identity. I think you could certainly say that about Jews, and I think you could probably say that about most Catholic ethnicities. That they became Protestants. I mean, not in the literal sense, but you know what I mean. It's like they
Right.
became, they embraced, they assimilated to enough of a degree that they became Americanized in that sense. The question is, can that continue? Like, for example, would I know this is unfashionable to mention, but there were questions about whether Muslim immigration could result in that.
Right.
There are
Well, I mean,
questions about.
yeah, I mean, I think that in these cases, in some ways they did assimilate, and in some ways the culture assimilated to them. So in religion, it is certainly true that the American bargain has been that as long as you become a Protestant, you can be whatever you want. And you can be a Catholic Protestant, you can be a Jewish Protestant, you can be a Muslim Protestant. And
Right.
one of the reasons I am not so very concerned about the future of Muslim immigration or Muslim Americans is that I think that there is considerable evidence that Islam in America is becoming Protestant in this lowercase p American sense. And when I say Protestant, I mean that you regard religion as a matter of personal belief and a religious community as a voluntary association. So you pick what church or synagogue or mosque you attend based on what you think. It's not a status that you inherit and that's binding on you. That's small p Protestant. And in that
Right.
sense, assimilation, I think, was very powerful. In other areas, it went the other way around. So there is some very interesting recent research about the origins of the New Deal that makes a convincing case that the adoption of the American welfare state would not have been possible without the different political and cultural preferences of the so-called new immigrants who arrived after the Civil War. And famously, in the 1930s and before, their preference for a larger and more expansive state was pitted against the preference of most Anglo-Protestants for a much more limited state. So in that case, I don't think it happened that the Anglo-Protestants assimilated the immigrants, as was the case with religion. I think it was the other way around. And the assumptions about the function of the state and the role of government that were considered radical and alien 100 years ago are now the object of consensus. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the other side of it, and I also think that there's a great value traditionally in the um, the enforcement, or not enforcement, but recognition of ethnic and religious communities in the United States. And I think they used to have much more pronounced ethnic and religious communities. Big cities, right up until after World War II, had, very, noticeably Jewish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, and people did share an ethnicity there, but yet they also strove to be part of the national fabric. And I think there was a great virtue to that. I think that in a way we lost some of that with, I don't know, forced integration, or just, these various programs that pushed people out into the suburbs and destroyed some of these very core neighborhoods. So,
I very much agree.
excuse me?
I very much agree. I mean, I
Yeah.
think we shouldn't romanticize the old ethnic enclaves, which had plenty of problems, but it's not clear to me that it was pure gain when people moved to the suburbs or adopted a more sort of generic American identity. There's a wonderful film that you may know by the director Barry Levinson called Avalon,
I've
which is a
heard of it.
depiction of this development in a Jewish family in Baltimore soon after World War II. And it's a very sad movie because it's clear that, at least for Levinson, and it's broadly autobiographical, more was lost in the adoption of a sort of generically, or as we might say, normal American life and identity than was gained.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that when ethnic groups, whether they be Jews, or, I mean, in Boston, it was Italians and Irish even, were basically moved out to the suburbs, they became white.
In
I
a
mean,
sense, well, I wouldn't say
um,
I wouldn't say that they became white. What I would say is they became Americans. They became
well,
American.
they lost their ethnic identity. I mean, maybe they'll go to church. I know, like here in Boston, they have like Italian festivals in the summertime, Saints festivals, and you get people coming in from the suburbs who want their children to see what it used to be like to be Italian.
Right.
Because they don't
I mean, one
remember. I mean,
one
it's
way
like a
that sometimes this development is described is that they lost their hyphens. Once they had been Italian American or Jewish American or Irish American, and they just became American, and retained only the most vestigial, once a year symbolic association with their original community, rather than being part of a sort of autonomous cultural and neighborhood life.
right. And I mean, that certainly describes most people I know. It describes most people in my own family who really,
Mine as well. I mean,
yeah,
the story of my family is the classic story that's told in Avalon of immigration followed by life in an ethnic enclave in the north end of Boston, which was Jewish before it was Italian.
yep.
Then moving out to Dorchester, which in those days was a step up for them, and then finally to Brookline and Cambridge, where they live to this day.
Well, I mean, Sam, you have the same background I have. Our people probably know your people. All right.
It's
Anyway,
entirely possible.
yeah. But I'm kind of reaching toward the end here. It's been really an interesting talk, and we're really only scratching the surface of the definition of American nationalism, and that in bas relief contrast to other nationalisms. And but we should maybe pick it up another time. Sam, mention if you don't mind where people can get your books and any websites you'd like to mention.
Yes. So my book, After Nationalism, will be published in the spring, but it is already posted on Amazon. If you search either for the title or for my name, and I believe they're taking pre-orders. Otherwise, you can easily find it in the catalog of the University of Pennsylvania Press that's bringing it out.
Excellent. Well, Samuel Goldman, I want to thank you for joining me. Maybe we could do it again once the book is out more fully.
It would be a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
All right. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Was that good for you?
Oh, it was excellent. I'll send you
Great.
a link when it's up on YouTube.
Wonderful. I look forward to it.
Thank you. Good, good. Take care.